I was actually in Johnson City, Tennessee at the time. People would want to know, where's Johnson City, Tennessee? So, and then I also got involved in hospice. I wound up taking over the medical leadership of our hospice program for 14 years. The reason why I got involved in doing these things was because I realized that there were huge gaps in the care of this patient population. And that these gaps, these care gaps, this is the nosology that Zach and I have actually come up with. These care gaps existed, and here I was trying to plug these gaps so I could take better care of these patients. And a huge missing piece in this patient population was in the post-acute care setting. That is, patients would come to the hospital, we'd fix them up, put Band-Aids on them, and send them back home without any intermediate place to put these patients, and they would fail. And that's why the national bounce back rate for COPD upon discharge was high teens, mid 20s, depending on where you're at. So one of the things I did was start an intermediate kind of service line where I approached a rehab hospital that had a lot of empty beds and said, would you be interested in taking care of this patient population? We embedded a respiratory therapist there at the hospital and proved that this service could work, reduce length of stay for patients that were in the hospital with acute respiratory problems, and improve outcomes in terms of reducing bounce back rates. So we would discharge the patient from the acute care setting to this rehab hospital where we had the sort of inpatient pulmonary rehab thing going on. The average length of stay was about 19 days. By the time the patient would leave the rehab hospital and actually go home, they had attained a health status probably better than before they got acutely ill and wound up in the hospital. So it was about this time that my path crossed Zach Gantt's path. I was actually trying to do the math this morning while I was in the shower, and I figured that when Zach and I first met, he was probably about 20, 21 years of age. This was about 15 years ago. And it turned out that Zach had a similar fire in the belly, a passion for this patient population, and he was working on solutions to also fill these gaps in the continuum of care. And we realized that we had a lot in common, and we decided that it would be a good thing to join forces. So Zach Gantt and myself have been working together with this patient population for about 15 years, and it has been a joyful relationship. We both had the fire in the belly, and we've been working over the past 15 years. The title of this presentation is Changing the World, in plugging these gaps and coming up with hopefully a seamless continuum of care for this patient population. And I think that we are there now, and we want to share that with you today.
Thanks, Dr. Seifer. And most of you guys know me, but I'm Zach Gantt, respiratory therapist. And if you know me, you know that I'm very passionate about managing COPD patients and about respiratory care. It's one of my biggest passions. And if you have ever heard me talk about it before, you know how excited I get just talking about making a difference in people's lives. And so when I first met Dr. Seifer, this respiratory therapist came to me and said, hey, we've got to go down to this office in Shelbyville, Tennessee. So we found a doc who speaks the same language as you. And so I went down there to meet him. And the first time I met Dr. Seifer, I knew instantly that we did speak the same language, but also that we were going to do some big things together. And so I knew that because when I first met him, he was just so excited and passionate about making a difference in patients' lives. And so we had an instant connection because of that. But he gave me an assignment. And the assignment was, he said, I want you to read these 2 books and then come back and see me in a week. And so I thought, I've never came to a physician's office before where they gave me such a tough assignment to read 2 books before I came back and talked to him again. So the 2 books were The Tipping Point and Complications. And so I realize now more than ever why he told me to read those books. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about those books and how it formed our relationship and how we got to this place we're at. And also, you know, the title of this talk is Changing Your World. It's really about how do you change your world in your environment? Whether you're a sleep tech, whether you're a respiratory therapist working in the hospital, in a nursing home, working in the home, wherever you're at, you can change the world for the people that you're around just by changing who you are and your attitude towards what we do. And so I hope that you leave this talk today with just a newfound passion for doing your job, for doing managing patients, taking care of patients, wherever you're at in your career. And so the tipping point, let me talk about that just a second. The tipping point is this theory that is simply that at some point, any product, any change, anything that happens in life hits a tipping point. And that tipping point is that there's a lot of hard work that goes into a new product or to a new idea, a new concept, or to changing who we are. And at some point you hit the tipping point and all that hard work starts to pay off, and then you hit the downhill slope. And that's when it's much easier and you've got momentum behind you, and that's when change starts to happen. So if you've never read this book, I recommend that you do read it because it's an amazing book. But it really goes into different things like crime, you know, movements like Converse shoes and different types of movements over the years and how they were formed and how they got to the tipping point and then how they tipped over the edge. And so it's really about if you want to change something or if you want to create something new, you've got to understand the process of what that looks like. And so part of that process is that it's really about a few different types of people. So the book really talks about how there's 3 different types of people that make change, that create change. One of those are mavens. And so they're the data bank. They've got all the information. They cause change by sharing their knowledge, by sharing what they know. So they're the experts in a field. The next one are the connectors. The connectors are kind of the people that you guys probably all know somebody like this who, when you talk to them about something, they're like, oh, I got to introduce you to my friend. And they connect you to this person or that person. So they're the ones that connect people together. I know that for me in my life and in my career, connectors have made the biggest difference in just being able to help us get to a place where we've grown our business, where we've been able to do new things, new ideas. It's all about the connectors. And then the salesman, which is the guy that can persuade somebody to do something. So the tipping point is really about having these different types of people to be able to be change agents in our lives. And then
Zach, can I jump in here for a second?
Yes, sure.
And the important concept here is that most people who lead change actually have elements of all 3 of these types within them. I mean, that you tend to have a predominant type, but most change agents, like myself, like Zach, we have knowledge, the maven, we are connectors, and we're salesmen. So we have elements of all 3. So these are not mutually exclusive. They actually are complementary qualities. And I'm sure that the people that are listening can probably, you know, look at themselves in the mirror and say, yeah, I do have those various elements, but maybe you have one particular element that is your stronger suit.
Yeah. And so the next book was Complications. And so Complications is really about healthcare today. It was written by Gantt. If you haven't read it, I also recommend it. This is obviously not a book club, so I'm not going to recommend any more books today. But it's an amazing book because it outlines some of the challenges of healthcare today. And even though it was written 15, 20 years ago, it's still very true today. And those challenges are that healthcare is very fragmented. Healthcare is not set up to manage chronic conditions. Healthcare is not set up to support, outcomes and to support quality. And so we've seen a lot of changes in the last 10 years that are moving us in that direction, but there's still, we still have a long way to go. There's still no payment for managing COPD in the home. There's still no payment for, managing chronic disease. There's only payment for equipment. So when you think about the sleep side, when you think about respiratory, really we're still operating in this ecosystem where we're getting paid for a device, we're getting paid for a service, we're getting paid for or not a service, but a product, and then the service just comes with that product. And so we have to change that. We have to change the way healthcare is set up. And so that's really what we set out to do many years ago, was to say, how do we figure out a way to get payment for respiratory therapy services, to get payment for outcomes, to be able to prove out that there is a way to provide a much better quality service and get paid for it. So today, the current ecosystem that we live in is really set up, and it's still like this, to manage acute care episodes and not to manage or support individuals with progressive chronic disease. And so we've got this challenge still today, even though we've made great progress in value-based care, we've still got large challenges in how do we manage chronic diseases in the home and how do we get paid for outcomes. And so part of the complication that we see today is that you've got this chronic disease problem. So 50% of Americans have one or more chronic diseases, and those chronic diseases account for 75% of spending. So the majority of spending in our healthcare system today is spent on managing chronic conditions. And so it's really the law of the few that there's a very small population of people that take up the majority of healthcare spending, and that really make healthcare so unaffordable for all of us. And so we also have another challenge, which is that we've got this aging population. We've got a population of baby boomers who are turning 65. Every 8 seconds, somebody turns 65. So we've got 10,000 people per day turning 65. So we've got a challenge already with our current ecosystem. We've got a challenge already with the way that we're not set up to manage chronic conditions, and it's the cause of so much of our spending. And then you've got baby boomers who are getting older and getting to a place where they're needing more healthcare services. And so their population of people needing healthcare services is growing very rapidly. And so if you look at that, this is number of patients in different years, 2000, 2010, 2020, and 2030. These are number of patients who have those chronic conditions. And so if you see there in 2030, we're going to see a huge jump in multiple chronic conditions. And so we're already not set up to be able to manage chronic conditions with the financial structure that's in place. And then you add to that we've got so many people that are aging in the baby boomer population, turning 65 or getting older and needing more services. And so it really creates this environment where we've already got a fractured system. We've already got some fragmentation in how healthcare is delivered. And so we're going towards a train wreck. And I think that there's challenges that are out there. There's so many challenges in our healthcare space that we can address. And those challenges could be addressed by us, and so how do we become the change agents in this situation? And then if we narrow that down to COPD, COPD is one of the biggest causes for readmissions. It's one of the biggest spending, the biggest spend in the healthcare system. And so if we looked at data, which I'm going to show you here in a second, from various different states, and we see time and time again that COPD is either number 1, number 2, or number 3 in their spending for chronic conditions. It's also number 1, 2, or 3 in the reasons that patients come back and have readmissions. Now hospitals are getting fined for those readmissions, but there's still not any good solutions out there. We've seen programs pop up with respiratory navigators. We've seen programs pop up where people have tried to do different types of models, but there's still not a good reimbursement structure out there. And so it's, how do you solve that problem? And because there's no good reimbursement structure out there, we've got this very reactive cycle of care. So our COPD patients, they go to the hospital, have a flare-up, an exacerbation. Nobody's there to help them through that, so they end up in the hospital. They get acute therapy, get stabilized, get sent back home, but they're not prepared for the next exacerbation. They're not prepared for what's going to come next. So in 6 months or in 3 months or in 2 months, they have another exacerbation, they get another pneumonia, they end up back in the hospital again. So we can break that cycle just by having respiratory therapists, being able to provide that care in the home. But we see it over and over again that cycle continues and continues and continues. And that's where all that spending is coming from that I was talking about a second ago. This is from a document that was put together down in Florida. Florida's got a very large retiree population. And so down in Florida, this outlines some of the shortfalls for managing populations. And the number one expense came from COPD. So 18.7% of their potentially preventable events. So that means that patients who went to the hospital that probably didn't need to go to the hospital. If they were better managed in the home, they wouldn't have gone to the hospital. And so this is the shortfalls that were outlined. And this really goes to the fact that there's no way to get paid or to manage patients in the home effectively. And so the missing links were effective care extensions into the community, member access to care programs, care coordination with complex patients, standardized and specific quality metrics, and sourcing chronic care COPD programs. Essentially, this is outlines the fact that there's no respiratory services paid for in the home. Now you see insurance companies who are trying to solve some of these problems with various different programs, but we still have the struggle of, you don't have respiratory therapists in the home. You're still not going to be able to solve COPD, which is a more complex problem. And I think Dr. Seifer's got a pretty good story from a time that he spoke at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that he could share with us here.
Yeah, it was back in, just to show you how long we've been pushing this stone up the hill. Back in 2008, I was invited to attend a meeting in Washington, D.C., where there was a senior member of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation who was invited to speak on the topic of this tsunami of chronic disease that was coming our way. I was also asked to speak. They had a senior representative from the Central Budgeting Office, from CMS. So it was a group of heavy hitters. I actually felt like I didn't belong there at the time. I was a little intimidated, and it takes a lot to intimidate me. And what happened was the lead speaker from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, he got up, he was the first speaker. I was going to follow him. And he was talking about chronic disease and the tsunami of chronic disease that was coming. And his entire shtick was common problems, shared solutions. So multiple times he was saying common problems, shared solution. That he was saying that the approach to managing chronic diseases, including COPD, common problems, shared solutions. And I don't know how many of the 214 participants that are presently listening ever saw The Karate Kid, but as he's talking about common problems, shared solutions, I'm seeing wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. And I'm listening to him and I'm thinking he's wrong. I'm thinking he is wrong. And as I'm listening to him, I'm actually having to change my talk in my head because I need to respond to what he is sharing. So he finished speaking, and to thunderous applause, and then he left the room because he had to go to attend some other meeting. And then they introduced me, and no one knew who I was. That I was from Johnson City, Tennessee. They like, where's that? And I get up there and I state to the audience, that was, very impressive, very well done. But I actually then I said, common problems, shared solutions. I actually did the wax on, wax off thing with my hands, and half the people in the audience got it and started giggling. I said, that does not work when it comes to COPD. COPD, the solution for COPD requires a very specific skill set, very specific knowledge, and very specific interventions. And you could have heard a pin drop in the place. I mean, I really did that. But I had to deliver, and I said, okay, to the audience, you all lay people, but you all know how is hypertension diagnosed, how high blood pressure. And everyone in the audience knew they put that thing on your arm, the blood pressure cuff. And then I said, everyone, you're lay people, but you know how diabetes is diagnosed. And everyone in the audience, their heads are bobbing. Yes, we check blood sugar. Then I said, does anyone in the audience know how to diagnose COPD? Not one hand went up. That demonstrates a huge difference between how you're going to attack the problem of hypertension or diabetes from a population health standpoint and how you're going to attack the problem of COPD, when the bottom line is most lay people don't know that COPD is not diagnosed clinically. It's diagnosed with spirometry. And we all know, people that are listening, you're respiratory therapists, most of you, I'm sure there's some other representation there, but mostly respiratory therapists. Unfortunately, even in the year 2020, half the PCPs out there still think they can diagnose this disease clinically. That is by laying of the hands. So right now, less than 50% of primary care physicians in the United States has spirometers in their offices. Of the ones that have them, maybe half of those providers are actually using them. And of the ones that are using them, maybe half of those providers actually know how to interpret the data correctly. So you have, if you are, you go to see a PCP, you may have maybe at best chance of 1 out of 5 that they're going to actually diagnose you correctly with COPD. So I shared that with the audience, and they were shocked, absolutely shocked. Is that what you were looking for, Zach? You kind of hit me up with that. I didn't know that I was going to be talking about that today.
Yeah, that was perfect. Yeah, I think the point, though, is that there's such a lack of knowledge out there, and that's why we see these huge numbers in COPD. There's a lack of knowledge. There's a lack of education. COPD is not sexy. Like a lot of diseases have spokespeople and have people that raise money. COPD is often looked at as something that we brought on ourselves, or somebody brought on themselves. And so it's a disease that has lack of funding, lack of interest, lack of education out there. And so that's something that we as the respiratory community can change. This is some data that looked at Medicaid spending for COPD. This is really crazy amount of spending that happens just for the Medicaid population in Florida. And so $502 million per year on 40,000 patients. So that was just a couple of years ago data. And so what you see here is the same phenomenon that we see everywhere, which is that a very small percentage of those patients make up the majority of that spending. So in this case, the $242 million a year in spending is made up of 4,158 patients. They average almost 60,000 per patient per year. So you've got a small population of patients who make up the majority of spending, and that's where most of the spending comes from. And so in this graph, the patients that are 20,000 or more is about 70% of the population. So it's or 70% of the spending coming from 15% of the population. Sorry. So it's a very small population that makes up the majority of the spending. We see this across the board with all chronic diseases, but especially with COPD. So met Dr. Seifer. He gives me this assignment to read these 2 books. And then we come together and we decide that we want to change the world for COPD patients. And so a tall order, but also an order that we knew that the patients we touch, whether it be 10, 20, 30, 100 or 1,000, that we could change their lives. And we knew that just by doing some good respiratory care. So what we're talking about here is nothing but just providing good care for our patients, right? So I've always called it the Wizard of Oz effect, which is when people ask, how do you get these amazing outcomes in your programs? And I'm waiting for somebody to pull the curtain back and realize that all we're doing is providing really good respiratory care. There's no magic bullet. There's no magic, nothing. Everything out there is already been published and we've already seen what to do. We know what to do. We just organized a process to be able to do it. And so Dr. Seifer and I remember some of our first conversations, we started to talk about, what do we want to accomplish? And the accomplishment was that we want to make a difference in patients' lives and make a difference in how COPD and respiratory patients are managed. And usually, as Steve Jobs said, the people that are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do. And I think that's not talking about changing the whole world. That's talking about changing your world. Wherever you're at, if you're working in the hospital during this crazy time of COVID, if you're working in a skilled nursing facility or in the home, you can change the world for the people's lives that you touch. You can change the world for those people that see you every day. A smile on your face, being a positive force, being the positive energy around your department could change everything, right? So it's really not about saying I'm going to change the world completely like Steve Jobs did with the iPhone, but it's about saying, how could I change the world that I live in today? How could I change my environment today? How could I make somebody's life so much different because I took the time to care, and I took the time to spend with them and to understand more about them. And so we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you a video here of dynamic dialogue. Dr. Seifer, you want to say anything before I show that?
Sure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of motivational interviewing. Just sidestep for a second, for those of you who don't know me, I actually started off in healthcare with a psych background. And that psych background certainly put a different spin on the way that I look at things and the way that I problem solve. And it became clear to me also when I started in healthcare that one of the things that is not taught during healthcare, whether medical school, residency, fellowship, is communication skills. Fortunately, I had a leg up on that because of my foundation in behavioral science, in psychology and behavioral science. But it's not taught. So the bottom line is, unfortunately, many healthcare providers don't know how to effectively communicate. They do not know how to effectively engage their patients, their clients, their colleagues. And so what I started working on was, all right, let's figure this out. You know, I know how to do this and I do it naturally, and I do have this background in psych. So how do I put some form to this? And is this something that I can teach? The answer to that is yes. So I coined and trademarked a term called dynamic dialogues. It is my methodology for effective engagement. And I have actually been teaching it at a national level now for a few years. And the acceptance of it has been very positive. In fact, this is a plug for something. Up until now, there has been no micro-credentialing for respiratory therapists after their initial education to further advance themselves in the career. And I've been working with SUNY Upstate in Syracuse. And as of fall of next year, there is going to be a micro-credentialing course offered virtually online to respiratory therapists anywhere in the world. And one of the foundational modules of that course will be dynamic dialogues. So I think that kind of puts the golf ball on the tee there for you. And Zach, if you can run that video, that'd be great.
In our current healthcare system, the consumer has this attitude of accountability for the provider. That is, I expect you to be there for me when I need you, and I expect you to fix me when I need you to fix me. But I have no accountability to you as a consumer, as a patient. And that does not work. And that is why our healthcare system today is floundering, why it is broken, why healthcare costs are escalating out of control.
So when I first heard Dr. Seifer speak about dynamic dialogues, I was blown away. And the reason was because it made so much sense.
The fundamental problem here is this lack of mutual accountability between the provider and the consumer. I know that if I'm going to keep that individual healthy and get them to a point where they have the best quality of life they can possibly have, I need that person's help. They need to help me help them. Just having information is not enough to change behavior. So I have to engage with the consumer, and then once I have that person engaged in that way, that person can change their behavior.
I feel so confident and comfortable and well cared for.
And that is what dynamic dialogues is all about. It's about establishing that kind of engagement. A fundamental, foundational concept to dynamic dialogues is the art of being present. It means more than just showing up physically. It means more than just turning off your cell phone.
Dynamic dialogue starts before you're in the room. It starts before you're in the building. It starts before you get out of bed in the morning.
I have to clear my mind I have to put myself in the moment. I have to leave my personal baggage at the door, whatever my personal prejudices are.
People want to be heard and want to be valued. They want to be respected as a person.
You have to be willing to be vulnerable, or be willing to put yourself in a vulnerable position to gain that insight from another person.
So can you be empathic with another human being unless you also open yourself up?
Being able to treat others the way you want to be treated.
If you don't understand where that person's coming from, you could be putting all this effort in and they're just not going to go with it because you don't get what's important to them.
Part of being vulnerable is knowing what you don't know. And to admit you don't know something requires that you are humble. You have to accept that you cannot know everything.
I was approaching a conversation with someone with knowing I was right, knowing that I cared, but I had forgotten to listen. I'd forgotten to quiet myself, and I'd forgotten to learn.
Dynamic dialogues is not just what you say. It's not just your voice. It's not just what they say back to you.
Dr. Seifer listens not only to you, but to what's underneath, what you're saying underneath. You have trust in each other.
You need to always be authentic. You cannot fake this. To engage this way requires a certain exposure that takes energy. But the return, if you do it right, it feeds your soul.
It makes you a better you, it makes the other person a better other person, and it makes work and play and engagement much more interesting and much less combative.
There's this expression that providers use all the time, and I hate it. That person is non-compliant. They shun all responsibility. It's all on the patient. Whereas when I have an individual, a patient, that is not taking their meds, not doing the things that I want them to do, I feel like, okay, I have to take a different approach. What can I do differently to connect with this individual so that this individual can be successful in whatever they're trying to accomplish?
It takes a certain patience to put the goal sort of aside for a moment, to start by building that state of engagement with someone.
My approach when I first meet a new patient, a new individual that I'm trying to have a dynamic dialogue with, my approach is, there you are. And once you effectively engage, you get to a point of engagement, then you're in a new place altogether. It's here we are. It's a we. It's not me, it's not you, it's we.
There's a real sense of working together.
We are now in a place where we can now move from point A to point B.
You have to engage people to be successful.
We can establish a relationship of mutual accountability that is, that person is going to hold me responsible for commitments that I make to him or her, but I can hold that person, that patient, that colleague responsible to commitments that they've made to me.
It's that investment on both parties to say, I'm invested in helping to make this change happen. And it's not just one person's responsibility.
I am there for you, and I will work with you until we get this right.
He treated me like a human being. He listened to what I had to say. He let me have part ownership of the conversation of what was going on. And if I told him I didn't want something, he trusted my instincts.
People don't want to be bossed around. They don't want somebody walking in and telling them what 15 things they need to change about how they're managing their life.
The pushback that I've gotten from many providers over the years is, hey, I'm a busy provider and I'm seeing 40 patients a day and I don't have time for dynamic dialogues. I need to get in, get out.
It's easy to walk in with an agenda, and I think this is really challenging people to take an approach that respects what each person brings to the table.
Once you get good at this, you're actually more efficient. You can get in and out of a room in 5 minutes, and that patient is going to feel like you were in there for 20 minutes.
Even though it was only a short period of time that we were together in the office, it was enough for me to gain trust in him and in what he had to say. But he also trusted me and what I had to say.
Almost invariably, we get to a better place faster with a lot more fun and a much greater sense of mutual accomplishment.
You'll get more information than you ever got before, and it'll allow you to actually be more effective in your treatment of this patient.
The actual experience feels less like work and more like an exploration, more like the thrill of accomplishing something together as a team. To the degree that there's work, it really comes from reminding yourself to employ that awareness.
I think the concepts are easy to grasp, but it takes a while, it takes some practice to internalize it.
I have to get up in the morning and remind myself when I look in the mirror to say, listen, you have an obligation as a leader to set an example and model active listening, mutual accountability, being open to feedback, being open to learning about my employees, about the physicians we work with, about our patients.
It takes time to find your style and to really live the values that this promotes, but it's well worth it because honestly, it's an approach that is based on respect and really gets results.
We engage in the conversation that is centered around what their challenges really are, or as I like to say, what keeps them up at night.
And the end result will be the individual will feel better and live better, and you'll feel better about yourself because that's why you went into medicine in the first place, hopefully, to help people.
I am 100% confident that anyone that truly is committed to dynamic dialogues will see a difference in their life and in the people's lives they're interacting with.
Frequently, when I'm speaking on the topic of dynamic dialogues, people ask me the question, how is dynamic dialogues different than, let's say, motivational interviewing or behavior modification or business training programs that are designed to improve efficiency?
I think that in a lot of approaches, the agenda is a change you want someone to make that you've already decided on before you walk in the door.
Dynamic dialogues is upstream of motivational interviewing. It's upstream of behavior modification and Six Sigma and Lean. You cannot facilitate movement from point A to point B until you've engaged.
I think that if you have studied motivational interviewing, yeah, that's a good knowledge base and a skill set to have. I think this takes it to a very different level.
Once I've gotten to a point of true engagement, then it's like mixed martial arts. I will use anything that I have training in, anything I have experience in, to be effective in helping that person move from point A to point B.
It's a customizing his approach to the patient depending upon the patient's personality and response. He's dealing with me and the disease as it affects me, not the disease and me as sort of the carrier.
You will benefit from it to such a great degree that you'll never go back to using any other process for interacting and learning about someone and helping them help themselves.
You could say, well, Dr. Seifer, how do you know that dynamic dialogues works? And I'll tell you how. You look at tobacco cessation programs across the United States. The best programs are producing 20 to maybe 40% quit rates.
He empowered me to make that choice to change and quit smoking.
I have published data, 6 months, quit rates approaching 85%. And that is chemically validated with this device, the PICO device, the carbon monoxide measuring device. How do I get quit rates approaching 85%? I firmly believe that it's because of dynamic dialogues leading to a place of mutual accountability, leading to this kind of result.
This is absolutely the way healthcare has to be delivered.
Honestly, I use dynamic dialogues 24/7. It is part of the fabric of who I am as a human being. It's fundamental to my how I communicate with the world around me, how I engage.
After being exposed to dynamic dialogues, it made me more self-conscious about my interaction with people. My husband, my daughters, even my mother.
You'll start doing it in most parts of your life because you just realize it's a better way to connect with people.
I don't think there's anyone that couldn't benefit from learning this process and practicing it.
You reap the benefits immediately, and I think that they're motivating to keep you, on that path.
I firmly believe that dynamic dialogues is something that if you embrace it, it will enrich your life in ways beyond what you could imagine today. You certainly will improve your relationship with your patients, but it'll improve your relationship with your significant others and your parents and your friends and your colleagues. And I do believe eventually it'll make you a happier, more content human being.
We need this because we need to change the conversation if we want to get different results. It's as simple as that.
Zach?
Yep.
Can I share with the audience a couple examples of what Dynamic Dialogues is all about to give them some starter tools to take back to their practices?
Yes.
Okay. So I do whole day workshops on this topic. So obviously we can't squeeze a whole day workshop into an hour and 15-minute presentation, especially this is just a piece of this presentation. But I'd like to give you a couple of real world tools that you can apply as soon as you go back to your world and start practicing what you do. So let me just use two illustrations. Number one, the difference in the power of an open-ended question compared to a closed question. And most providers, when they approach a patient or a colleague, but let's just keep this provider-patient focused, they go into a room and they machine gun the patient with closed questions. What is your name? How old are you? Who sent you here? Do you have this disease? Do you have that disease? And so what they get back are one-word answers. And there's a multitude of reasons why providers do this, but one of the most powerful reasons is that it maintains control of the dialogue in the hands of the provider. Most providers, if you look at their personality types, go into healthcare, and one of their personality traits, especially physicians, is they like to be in control. So if you riddle your patient with closed questions, it doesn't really give the patient the opportunity to take control of the conversation. And also, I think providers feel that this is just a more efficient way of getting information. Like I stated in the video, you can get in and get out. But if you ask a patient an open-ended question, it becomes much more engaging for you as a provider and for the patient. So let me give you an example. The very, very first time that I talked about dynamic dialogues was at an AARC Congress. I think it was in Indiana a few years ago. And I didn't know how well this would translate to a large audience. It was the first time I actually tried to have a conversation about dynamic dialogues with a large audience. And I got off the podium, got off the stage, took my microphone with me, and I went down to the people who had their name tags. And I just asked somebody randomly, what did you have for breakfast? And they looked at me in shock, like they didn't expect me to come down to the audience and start asking them questions. And then I got back, somebody would say, coffee. And then I asked another attendee of the Congress, what they had for breakfast, and they said nothing. And the other person said, you know, I had a power bar and a coffee. And then I spotted this one guy who just looked like the lights were on, and he looked like he was getting my energy. And I went up to him and I said, how was your breakfast? And he just went to town. Oh, my breakfast was wonderful. I read the New York Times. I made my coffee in a French press. I had a poached egg. And he just went on and on and on. And then I looked around the room, and I could just see all the light bulbs going off above everyone's head, because they got it. What did I ask everyone up to that point? I had asked everyone a closed question. What did you have for breakfast? That's a closed question. And I was getting a shopping list of answers back. But when I asked that gentleman, how was your breakfast? You see the difference? I can't see any of you, but I'm hoping that I'm getting smiles and head nods. The point here is that I was willing to give control to that individual. And when I said, how was your breakfast? He just all this energy came out of him. It was an open-ended question. So let's move on to another thing. But the point I'm making here is anytime you have the opportunity to ask one of your clients, one of your patients, an open-ended question as compared to a closed question, take that opportunity. Ask an open-ended question, and you will see very quickly the dividends that you will receive, that the dividends that are paid by just relaxing a little bit and giving that patient an opportunity to take control of the conversation. All right, number one. Number two, I'll give you another take home that you can apply immediately, and it will have immediate impact in the interactions you have with your patients and your colleagues and your significant others, like I said in the video. It's called positive intent. And what is positive intent? Well, it's much easier to use this concept actually in a provider-patient setting, because I'm sure many of you will go into a room with a patient, and what you get back is hostility. It happens frequently that I go into a patient room, my first encounter with a patient, and that patient is not in a good place. They don't feel well. They've seen multiple providers before they've seen me. They have not gotten satisfaction, and they have set themselves up for failure, that they anticipate that I'm going to come in there and take the same approach with them that every provider is taking with them up to that point in time. I'm going to go in there with my laptop, riddle them with closed questions, populate my laptop screens, and walk away. So they're in a bad place, and I have to deal with that. So I have had patients be very hostile to me when I've walked in a room, and we don't have the time for me to go on with the stories about the examples that I can tell, the stories that illustrate this. But what gives me the ability to get past the patient's hostility and to be therapeutic is the positive intent. And the bottom line is, unless that patient is in that room wearing orange, in shackles, with a guard standing out in front of that door, what do I know about that patient? And I hope what many of you are saying or thinking right now is, I know that patient, that individual, that human being wants me to help them. They want help, or they wouldn't be there. And I've asked patients, why are you here? He says, I don't know. My doctor told me that I needed to come. Or I'm here because they pointed at their spouse. They forced me to come here. Well, these people, I'll say to them sometimes, I'm not buying what you're selling because you're a pretty big guy and she's not that big, and I can't see her forcing you here. So at the end of the day, these people are there because they want help. And it is your job to figure out how to navigate around all these landmines that they might be putting out in front of you so that you can help them. So I think if you just take back those two tools and do not learn anything else about dynamic dialogues, and those two things, if you apply those two tools, you'll see very quickly the positive effect it'll have on your ability to help your patients. The concept of positive intent and open-ended questions. I'll turn it back to you, Zach.
Thank you. And I think that the foundation of everything that we've done with programs is, oh, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I think the foundation of everything we've done with programs is all about patient engagement. It's all about dynamic dialogue. And I'll show you a couple examples here. One of those is the first program that me and Dr. Seifer worked on together was a company out of Nashville. And we were able to come in to a DME environment, a home care environment, and say, how can we do something different? How can we create a model that is not tied into just the equipment, but create some outcomes? And so what we did, I guess it was probably 2010 or 11, we started a program called CHROME, and CHROME was Comprehensive Respiratory Outcome Management. And so the idea was, how do we take the DME model of providing equipment in the home, and normally we're providing the services as a value add, not getting paid for it. So how can we figure out a way to get paid for the services? So when we came together, our goal was to provide better care for our patients, but also to create a way to get paid for the services so we can continue, because we know if there's no way to get paid for it, there's no way to fund it, it's not going to last very long. And so we did that by, we took the ventilator population that we had, and we started to prove out these outcomes. So across the Tennessee, we had just a couple of patients, and over 2.5 years, we went from 10 counties of Tennessee to 25 states. So we took it to a nationwide company, and we really focused on how could we reduce readmissions, also reduce days spent in the hospital by our patients, and then how do we take those outcomes and move into partnering with hospital systems and payers and skilled nursing facilities and getting them to pay us for the outcome, not just for the equipment. And so that's really the model we went after, was to say, hey, it's not about the equipment. The equipment is part of the equation, just like medication is part of the equation. So we're treating a symptom, but what it's really about is engagement with patients. And so how do we engage with patients, and how do we create outcomes that are sustainable, but also that we can go back to the payer or to the hospital system and show them, hey, this is something that we're doing that's making such a huge difference financially and from patient outcome standpoints. And so this is why you should pay us for these types of services. And so that's what we did. We convinced health plans. Me and Dr. Seifer stood in front of many insurance companies before we finally convinced one to pay us for a service like this. But we were able to prove out that if you paid respiratory therapists in the home, then you're able to create amazing outcomes. And those outcomes are not just reductions in readmissions, but are also reductions in 12-month admissions. So what we found was, for a COPD population, managing patients, engaging patients on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis, we were able to not only reduce readmissions, but also reduce 12-month admissions. So over time, we're able to reduce readmissions and 12-month admissions. So in 2014, we got together again. We first started a telemedicine service, and then we started Encore with this concept that how can we build software around the model? And so just kind of to fast forward where we're at now, the idea was to build respiratory management software to be able to focus on reducing readmissions, which now we've been able to accomplish across the country. Our partners are reducing readmissions by 70–80% on a regular basis. And then how do we start to integrate with devices? And so how do we start to solve problems? So we've got all this data out there, but there's no way to collect all this data into one place. There's no way to really accumulate the data and tell a story, because really what we need is an integrated system that allows to be able to not just be able to manage patients, but also be able to manage all the device data, equipment data, all those types of devices. And so that's what we do now, is really focus on how do we bring all these things into one place, and how can we create those kind of outcomes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Seifer here. We're going to talk a little bit about what we've done with his health system over the last couple of years, and how we've been able to implement programs there that really changed everything and how they operate inside of that system.
Thank you, Zach. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with what's been happening in New York State. I actually moved to upstate New York. If I was any further up, I'd be in another country. I could roll out of bed to the left and be in Canada in 20 minutes. So when I left Tennessee, I transitioned to upstate New York. New York, Governor Cuomo received $8 billion from the federal government about 6-7 years ago, with the idea that New York State could come up with a better mousetrap, a better way of taking care of its Medicaid population. And an acronym for this reorganization, restructuring of Medicaid services for New York was called DSRIP, DSRIP. And they couldn't call it something simple like restructuring of Medicaid. They had to come up with DSRIP. And they took the entire state of New York, which is a pretty big geography, and divided it essentially into 25 buckets. And then they distributed funds of that $8 billion proportion to the population that bucket was serving. So the Adirondack Health Institute, is the bucket that my health system, St. Lawrence Health System, was put into. They received $187 million of that $8 billion. And then they put out an RFP and said, if you can come up with a better mousetrap to take care of some disease, we're interested. So I proposed a grid, a solution grid, a management grid from soup to nuts, a seamless continuum of care for COPD. And frankly, this represented my life work, and a good part of Zach's life work was incorporated into this grid. And they stated that the most money you could get for any of these proposals was $250,000. Remember, I am a positive deviant. I'm an outlier, so I didn't listen to that. I asked for $1.5 million, even though they said the cap was $250,000, and I actually got $750,000 grant money from the state of New York to power this grid. So we brought this solution grid to our health system, and over a period of 2 years, we're able to demonstrate unequivocally that if you were to implement this grid in a health system, that you could see very robust results in a relatively short period of time. Zach, you want to hand it back to you and at this point, or do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, so this is kind of a summary that you're seeing on your screen. Is the summary of what we were able to accomplish. And so just so you know how this model worked, we talked about the grid, but what that looked like was we put a COPD navigator inside the hospital, inside of the practice with Dr. Seifer. We had a DME involved, so home care company involved. We also had a skilled nursing facility involved where we had respiratory services inside that skilled nursing facility. And so we had all these different pieces that came together, from the hospital to the pulmonary clinic to all the post-acute care services. And they all use the same software, the same process, the same program, with the idea that, hey, if we could control all these gaps in care, then we could stay connected to patients and we could solve a lot of the problems that we see. And then you include some of the things we just talked about with patient engagement, how we're engaging patients, how Dr. Seifer engages patients already, and then how do we get the home care company, the nursing home, everybody else engaging patients the same way, so we can have that continuum of care. And so if you look at some of these numbers here, not only did it improve outcomes greatly, but it also drove a lot more revenue to Dr. Seifer's practice, because we were able to make sure that those patients who left the hospital didn't fall through the care gaps. And so oftentimes patients leave the hospital, and when they leave the hospital, they're not following back up with pulmonary. They don't have a ride to follow back up. They don't have the right medications. They can't afford their medications. You got all these challenges that happen, and when those challenges happen, normally they just fall through the gaps and they fall through the cracks. But if you've got all these people engaged at the same level, it creates a whole new ballgame for patient engagement and for making sure patients don't fall through the cracks. And so that's really what we saw here, was that just scratching the surface in the first couple of years, we had tremendous outcomes in managing this patient population through our system. Dr. Seifer, you want to walk us through this graph? Or you want me to?
Well, unfortunately, tell me what everyone has seen, because just so everyone knows, and if you've been reading the national news, my health system was actually one of the health systems that was hacked by that ransomware that hit hospitals from coast to coast, and our computers, we were actually completely shut down for 2 weeks, and now we're digging out. One of the problems, which I'm obviously experiencing right now, is the video feed. What I'm actually looking at right now is still the Dynamic Dialogues movie. So just Zach, tell me what you're looking at, and then I can walk you through it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the Pulmonary Independence Program, reduces hospitalizations and ACO, the graph that shows the reduction in readmissions, and also shows when the navigator went out on maternity leave.
When Kathy went out. Yeah. So I know this pretty well, so I can do it just in the head. We implemented this initiative, this grid, and over a period of 2 years, we demonstrated a significant reduction, I think about a 30% reduction in hospitalizations for this patient population. There was a little bit of an uptick when our respiratory navigator went on maternity leave. We did plug somebody in there to fill as a placeholder to fill the gap, but she just didn't have Cassie's skill set, her interpersonal skill set. She was not skilled in dynamic dialogues. She was not skilled in patient engagement, and it was clearly evident by how things really got derailed very quickly. And I was very happy when she came back from maternity leave and we got things back on track. But in hindsight, it was a gift that she went on maternity leave, because we wouldn't see that blip, and it wouldn't demonstrate an incredibly important point here. I'm going to check here. There are 226 participants right now. I presume most of you are respiratory therapists, and you're thinking about, especially in the COVID world and the future, where do you fit into this whole picture? You know, what in terms of job security, and I believe that this navigator is crucial to the success of a program like this. And that I do believe that health systems moving forward, all health systems are going to be looking for respiratory navigators to function in this very critical linchpin role. So this is a huge opportunity. I mean, I'm the kind of person who always likes to turn lemons into lemonade, but people are looking at the COVID crisis that we're suffering right now, and I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but it does create opportunities. And respiratory therapists, if I was a respiratory therapist and I was attending this Congress virtually today and listening to this, I would go, yeah, I want to explore that opportunity. How can I become a respiratory navigator in my health system to function in this very critical role? Now, does this role need to be specifically filled by a respiratory therapist? No. Could a nurse perform this role? Yes. But my first preference would be a respiratory therapist, because we're dealing with respiratory patients. Respiratory therapists have a unique skill set, different from nursing, that nurses don't have. So I see this as an opportunity. But you all who are listening, you need to be a self-starter, and you need to be looking for these kind of opportunities. So in hindsight, it was a really good thing that our respiratory navigator did go on maternity leave, because it really visually illustrates how important that person is, really. Do you want me to talk about anything else, Zach, about this graphic? Or you want to pop something else up for me to talk about?
No, that's good. I was just going to summarize here with the next graphic. So, this is what I talked about earlier, it's really about mission and margin, right? So we all want to make a difference in healthcare. And so we all want to do great things and provide better care for our patients. But creating the margin for that, being able to show that there is a reimbursement, there is a structure to get paid for those services, is really what matters to hospital systems, to payers, to be able to fund such a service. It would be great if healthcare was all about just making a difference, but it's not all about that. It's also a business. And so being able to create mission and margin at the same time. And when we're talking about COPD, when we're talking about sleep, we're talking about all these different environments, there's definitely a way inside of the current ecosystem, the current healthcare structure, to be able to create mission, which is the warm and fuzzy of let's make a difference in the healthcare continuum, and then margin, which is how do we get paid for these types of services. So there's definitely a way, and there's a way not only to get paid, but to be able to create a great margin of revenue for a health system or for an insurance company or for your department, just by making a difference in outcomes.
Zach, I'd like to jump in here. I'm a mission-driven person. I learned very quickly when I got into health, when I started practicing medicine in Johnson City, Tennessee, that even though I'm a mission-driven person, medicine is a margin-driven industry. And I know it sounds a little cynical, but it's not cynical. It's just reality. So anytime you are looking to make improvements in healthcare, if you are like Zach and I, you have to focus not just on, okay, what is the mission here, but how do I make this sustainable? How do I make this stand on its own financial legs? And that has always been a challenge for me, for Zach, but we have figured it out. And what we're sharing with you today is a mission that does have margin legs to stand on. Back to you, Zach.
And so now we've got the Spire slide shown up here, Dr. Seifer. You want to talk a little bit about Spire?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, because I'm flying blind here with my computer. So let me tell you about this company, Spire. But let's take a step sideways again. What we did here with the DSRIP funding and working with Encore and Nexus and doing all the things that we did, we were able to really move things in a very positive direction. But being a positive deviant that I am, the outlier that I am, I'm never satisfied with the status quo. So yes, we have really accomplished a lot, but could we do even better? And the answer is possibly yes. Now, also, meanwhile, COVID has hit us and hit the world. Now, pre-COVID, there was certainly a movement to look for technologies to allow extenders like myself, like Zach, not extenders, to allow providers like myself and like Zach to extend ourselves remotely. So there was an interest there for me personally, for Zach personally, for medical industry, but it was moving at a snail's pace. People strongly resisted this whole remote technology concept. Hospitals resisted it because they were afraid that it would impact negatively their revenue stream. Because if you're doing all this stuff as an outpatient, then they're not going to have these patients in the hospital. So the whole model for healthcare up until now made it very hard to get any kind of market penetration for any devices, technologies that would support remote healthcare delivery. What COVID has done, again, I'm looking for the lemonade within the lemons, it greatly compressed that need. And what's going to happen is that in a very short period of time, this whole remote patient monitoring technology will move forward what would have taken 10 years, 15 years, we're going to get there in 2 to 3 years. So that's where Spire comes in. So Spire is a company where they've come up with these medical grade tags that are embedded in patients' underwear that allow pretty much 24/7 continuous monitoring of respiratory patients. And I didn't know this. This was a bit, I'm sure many of you that are listening, there's now 224 participants, have purchased Fitbits. I had never purchased a Fitbit, but many of you have purchased a Fitbit or a Fitbit-like device that you put on your wrist. And then I would ask you, 6 months after you purchased that, were you still using it? A year after you purchased that device, were you still using it? And the literature clearly demonstrates that most people give up on their Fitbits within 6 months, and majority for certain within a year. Because it's something you got to put on. It's something you got to charge. It's something that is visible and you wear it. The technologies that have existed pre-Spire were technologies like that. If you have a chronic disease, you don't want to be reminded every day that you have that chronic disease by looking at your wrist and seeing some kind of device wrapped around your wrist. Plus, every time you take that device off to power it up, to charge it up, you're losing data. Imagine something that you get and then you embed it into your underwear. And I didn't realize this, but 85 to 90% of human beings will sleep in their underwear. So you even can continue to monitor the patient while they're sleeping. These things are washable, so you can throw them in the laundry. So once you embed them in half a dozen to a dozen of your underwear, you're pretty much then, it's completely passive, and that's the important word. If you want to do remote patient monitoring, you've got to find something that really is truly passive. And this technology is the very first truly passive technology that I have come across to monitor patients, respiratory patients. So once you make that commitment, it's in your underwear, you're good to go. And there's no battery charging. These batteries will last over a year. Now, so Spire actually reached out to me over a year ago because they knew what I was doing, and we started a dialogue. And then I brought Spire to the attention of Encore, and we've had this sort of dialogue going on. And now we're about ready to embed the Spire technology into my patient flow, my patients here in up New York, upstate New York. So we are going to be doing that and collecting that data, and hopefully being able to present that data to maybe CHEST of 2021, because I do believe that this technology will even improve upon what we've already done. Because imagine you have the opportunity, you have a patient who something is not quite right. They're not consciously aware of it, but the Spire technology can pick up on a decreased activity level on a patient, decreased steps. It can pick up on increased respiratory rate. It can pick up on changes in the morphology of the actual inspiratory and expiratory part of the breath. So their data has shown that they can pick up on aberrations days before possibly the patient will even be consciously aware of what's going on. So we are going to be bringing this technology to our beta site here in upstate New York and embedding it into our patient population, and we're going to start collecting data. We've been working on this for quite some time, and I do believe that we're going to go active with their device before the end of this year.
And so the Spire technology, it's really interesting because if you think about what you can get from vital sign monitoring, which we'll talk more about here in a second, there's so much more you can get by understanding behaviors. So we've been working with understanding behaviors for years now to say, how do we get to a place where we're doing passive monitoring? And passive monitoring, like Dr. Seifer said, something you put inside of somebody's underwear, which who would have thought of that? But putting something inside of your undergarments like that allows you to monitor much more of the day. Because like you said, sometimes people forget to put on their Apple Watch or their Fitbit, or they forget to charge it. And so being able to monitor more parts of the day means that we can passively monitor patients So this is really a game changer. If you think about for a respiratory patient or sleep patient, what could respiratory rate and steps tell us? For a respiratory patient, steps would tell a pretty big story about how active they are. Respiratory rate will tell us a pretty big story about we see deviations from their standard respiratory rate, and we know something's happening, either an acute situation or we start to see an exacerbation start to happen. And so if you think about that, some of the data that Spire has now shows that they can predict an exacerbation 4 days before it happens. Now combining steps and their new algorithm, so we think we can go all the way back to 7 days. So could you imagine if every COPD patient in the home or in a nursing home or in leaving the hospital had a technology like this, what that could mean? That could mean we could almost eliminate hospitalizations for COPD just with that data alone with the right algorithm. So the idea with this technology is really to say, how do we start to monitor patients passively? Because it's not about monitoring SpO2 or monitoring heart rate and blood pressures and getting on a scale. It's really about passive monitoring, and respiratory rate is something that's so underutilized, and being able to monitor and manage patients to predict things from happening. So we know that respiratory rate's always going to change. There's some really good sleep data out there that looks at predicting of patients by just monitoring the respiratory rate in sleep that ResMed did several years ago, and what that could mean for not only for their sleep status, but for their CHF status, for their COPD status. And so looking at behaviors is such a game changer in how we manage patients. And so if you start to look at what that would look like, you think about managing patients with respiratory therapists in the home or with sleep techs, being able to manage sleep populations. So if you think about how does that all play in? So if you had the management of the patient in the home, you had care coordination or phone calls. And then if you look at this graph, it's going over time. So the first 30 to 90 days, there's more interaction with a patient. And then over time, you start to use things like telemedicine and automation, like automated phone calls. We do clinical assessments right now through robocalls. A lot of patients don't like that, but 50% of patients will use automated phone calls. And so if we can do clinical assessments through automated phone calls, it allows us to collect data from patients without even having human contact. So it's not to replace human contact, but it's so we can stay connected with a patient over time. And then it gets to then you get to the passive monitoring piece where we're monitoring what we call vitality. And we're really able to monitor what's happening with that patient in real time through things like Spire, but also through some other automation. So if you think about that, using clinical time up front, and then over time using these new technologies that are emerging, we could manage respiratory patients, COPD patients so effectively and efficiently, and we could almost eliminate readmissions or admissions altogether. Most readmissions are preventable, and so if we were able to do that, then we would make a big difference in how we're managing patient populations. So telemedicine, I just want to touch on that a little bit. In the COVID challenge, we were able to use telemedicine to be able to intervene with patients. And so when we couldn't go in the home anymore, we said, hey, how can we still connect with patients? How are we going to be able to manage our patients? And so what we saw with one of our partners was that using telemedicine, respiratory therapy telemedicine service, we're able to be more productive. So we could deliver more assessments in a day, see more patients in a day, and the outcomes stayed the same. And so we found that switching from live visits over to telemedicine, we had similar results, but we could actually be more productive in how many patients we saw per day. So it's really interesting that, again, like Dr. Seifer said, COVID kind of pushed us over into a place where we were forced to use more technology that probably wouldn't have came into the home care space or the nursing home space for a while. But now we've kind of been forced to do that, and we've seen that outcomes are very similar. We can see more patients and we can have similar outcomes. And so if you think about what that means for our profession, it's a game changer. You think about all these technologies that are coming up, that are emerging, and then the fact that we can use telemedicine to connect with patients in the home, to connect with our patients who are on equipment, if we're a DME company, or from a hospital to be able to connect with patients after they discharge to make sure that they don't come back. So technology is out there and it's so easy to use. I mean, we're using it right now, the same type of technology. So our ability to stay connected to a patient has greatly improved if we just adapt to and engage with those technologies. And so currently, this is what we're seeing is in doing a program like we just outlined, is being able to reduce hospitalizations by at least 55% across the board, readmissions or ED visits by 80%. So we've seen drastic improvements in reducing readmissions, reducing hospitalizations, which means that our patients are better managed. Our patients are staying home. Our patients are able to be active again. We set a lot of goals for patients, and our plan and our process and our goal is that we can get people back as functional parts of their communities, of their families. We can get them back out even in the time of COVID. Obviously, that's a challenge, but get them up and moving again, get them functioning again and making a difference. And doing that means that we're going to reduce utilization. So really the idea here, this is Charles Darwin quote. I'm not a big fan of Charles Darwin, but this quote is one of my favorites. It's not the strongest of species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the ones that are most adaptable to change. And that's so true, because in our professions today, there's so much changing. There's so much happening. There's so much going on. And now is a time that if we could adapt to that change, we could change the future of our profession. And so I challenge you today to think about change as a good thing. In this time where we're in COVID and we've got so many challenges to do our jobs, I think it's so important that we are change agents. And a change agent is somebody who is positive, who is contagious. Being a change agent means that you've got this contagiousness about you of how excited and how engaged you are and how positive you are. And it's remembering that the little changes make a big difference. Being positive, going in tomorrow to work, going in Monday to work and being positive about what you do and how you do it could make a big difference for your coworkers, could make a big difference for your patients. And then if you start to do those little changes, then big changes will come in dramatic fashion. And so I just want to challenge you that even in the midst of all the chaos that's happening in the world, you can be a change agent in where you're at, in your job, in your family, in your friends' lives, in your patients' lives. And so the challenge today is to go out and change the world, be the change agent, be the positive deviant wherever you're at. Dr. Seifer, if you have anything to add to that, I think we've got about 5 minutes left for questions here.
I could add a lot, but you stated it all very, very well. So I'm just going to say ditto and leave those 5 minutes to do some question and answer. So I'll just sit here and if there's a question directed specifically for me, Zach, just let me know and I'll jump in. But no, you stated it very well. I don't need to add anything to that.
Okay, I think we'll turn it over to the moderator and see if we have any questions from the audience. I can't hear you if you're speaking. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? If you do, you can click on the question answer box down at the bottom, type in those questions, and we'll answer them if time permits.
In the meantime, while we're waiting to field questions, I'm going to put my cell phone number out there to any of the listening participants. If you want to reach out to me directly, do not hesitate. I'll also give you my email address. I'm here as a resource to support you in anything you're doing. So my cell phone number is actually, it's a Tennessee number. It's area code 423-718-3212. Again, that is area code 423-718-3212. And then my email is F as Frank, D as David, my last name, which is spelled S like Sam, E-I, F like Frank, E-R, at USA.net. So it's fdceifer@usa.net.
Okay, are there any questions from our audience? Sorry about the echo. Are there any questions from our audience? I see one. It says, Do you think telerespiratory therapy will kick off in more states? What can RTs do to promote this type of care in our field?
I do think so. I think that it's very dependent on you, anybody listening today, because the opportunity is there to connect with patients through telehealth. The opportunity is there. The technology is there. It's so easy to use. So if you think about wherever you're at in the hospital and home care, in a nursing home, again, the ability and the opportunity is there. It's just figuring out the model that works and figuring out a way to be able to connect with patients. So I definitely think it will happen. And I think that you can be the change agent that can make it happen if you dig into that and try to figure out ways to do it. Because now the HIPAA compliance guideline has been waived, which means that you can
St. Lawrence Health System in Pot.
You can use FaceTime or other technologies right now to do video for each telehealth with patients. You don't even have to have advanced technologies or specific technologies. You can use what you've got today in your hand, what you're watching this on. So I definitely think it's going to advance, and I think it directly is dependent on how much you bring it.
Okay, and then we have one more question. Do you do your dynamic dialogue teaching for any home health agencies?
I have not done dynamic dialogues for any home health agencies. I think it would certainly be a huge opportunity for the home health agency. I have done dynamic dialogues workshops for industry, companies that have devices and they have a sales force that is going out, reaching out to providers to introduce those providers and hopefully sell to those providers their particular devices. So yes, I have done whole day workshops for industry, but but that kind of industry, not home health organizations. But I think obviously the opportunity to do something like this for a Lincare or an Apria or any kind of home health agency. I mean, there's potentially a huge market for that. Yes.
Okay, I think we're out of time for our presentation. So thank you guys. We appreciate your time and appreciate you listening to us.